Hey guys. So we are back
Hello.
on a Sunday afternoon at 4 o'clock to actually present to you guys on our weekly topic. Isn't it exciting? Hi, Tree Engineer.
Yes, hello, hi everyone once again. Yep, welcome to another episode of the US Stock Picking. Yes. So finally, yes, we have Financial Missy here with us again today. Yep. So yeah,
Yeah, sorry
this
guys.
yeah, yes. So we can continue to have both the fundamental as well as the technical perspective, right, for both for the stock today. Yep. Hi Kel. Yep. Thanks for tuning in today.
Hi, y'all. Yeah. So thanks guys for spending your Sunday with us. Today we're very excited to present this particular stock to you guys, and it's actually called
Drum
make a
roll.
guess. Drum roll. Yeah, so we'll be actually presenting on target today,
Yep.
right? To
Yep.
actually share with you guys what is our thought on this particular stock to see whether is it a is it a good time? Is it a good company to actually invest in? So if you guys are with us, do hit on the like button so that we know that you guys are with us.
Yep, yep. Do click on that like button. Yep, so that we know that you are here and can hear us, loud and clear.
Yeah, right. Okay, shall we begin our session?
Yep, yep. Let's go.
Okay. I present first.
So, okay, you can go
Okay.
first.
So let me just share my screen, guys. All right. So guys, today we'll be talking about Target. Target is very exciting. Why? I'm pretty sure that most of you guys actually heard about this particular stock called Target. Um, yeah. So Target itself on Friday it actually closed at $237.20, which we saw a 1.45% increment on Friday itself. So exciting. So before I start proper, right, essentially want to remind you guys that this is never intended to be a financial advice. Any views, opinions, references, or anything shared, anything being mentioned today is actually not a buy or sell decision, right? It's not a recommendation in any way. So please do your own due diligence for why we are always wrong. Find a strategy that suits you, execute according to your strategy. That is something very, very important, and I cannot emphasize more. Right, guys? So okay, talking about the sentiments, right? In April 2022 nowadays, what are we looking at? So if you guys has been following us for the longest time, you have actually known that um, I was sharing since a couple of weeks ago that the market is likely to be moving, consolidating, moving within range, and my viewpoint on how the market is going to consolidate remains the same. As you can see, it went up to the upper line, and then after that, it's like retraced back more or less in the center right now. And how is it going to play out in the near future? Probably still within range until there's a breakout, but we will actually keep it in mind and review it on a weekly basis to see are we rebounding to a bullish market, or are we really going into a recession, into a bearish market? Right, so this is something that we really have to actually know, such that we don't do the wrong play, and and by that we want, if we want to make money off the market, we want to actually play with the momentum instead of against the momentum, right? So that's just something that is very important for all of us to actually bear it at the back of our head. And nevertheless, right, there's something, the sector rotation thing is something so interesting. In 2020, right, we saw market bottom because of COVID, right? And then because of that, interest rate was low and what's not. There was actually a boost in technology cycle. I mean the growth stocks to actually to exponentiate our portfolio. You can see, and then thereafter, in 2021, we saw a market top. Market went higher and higher and higher and higher and higher. And then there's been talks on the sector rotation here and there. And the latest update, right? I mean, not the latest update, but the latest trend is people has been talking about a lot about purchasing on basic material, energy. Why? Because of the Russian-Ukraine war, energy, staplers, healthcare. So these are the more in trendy kind of companies that was actually being discussed these days. Not saying that we are in a recession, but if you put it into this economic cycle of the stock market, it kind of put us into perspective on where are we right now and what can we actually tell for the near future. Not by me, by the economic cycle of which was established by professionals, right? So this is actually why we thought about talking about Target today, because moving forward, will the stapler company, the consumer defensive company, actually prosper? I don't know, but it's up to you guys to consider, right? So how does Target actually do? What's the kind of business does it operate on? Target, I'm pretty sure that for all you guys who actually travels to the West quite before or frequently or what's not, should have actually heard about Target itself. It's actually a general merchandise retailer specialized in, which is more concentrated in the US, right? It operates like online platform and as well as in-store platform. But ultimately, right, it just think about in Singapore itself, it works like our NTUC, our Cold Storage, our Sheng Siong, Giant, all this kind of thing. So it's essentially the same kind of concept. But because Singapore is small, the US is actually very big. So in the US itself, they have approximately 2,000 stores, right? And in fact, 2,000 stores across US is not a lot. because in US itself, it's a very capitalist country. You have Amazon to compete with, you got Walmart to compete with. There's a lot of other bigger and more established companies that is actually in competition with Target. And I'm not sure whether you guys know, Target's item tends to be a little bit more expensive. So that takes us to thinking, how is it doing financially? Is Target doing well financially such that it's a good time for us to invest? This is where we look at the financial statement. Right, so financial statement, as you guys should know, there's three things that we look at. Look at the income statement, balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. So far, so good. The income statement looks pretty decent. Net profit margin, not the highest, but it's still positive. At least it's still positive. Oh, sorry, guys. Oops. Okay, I should get rid of all the animations, which is not helping. It's a bit slow. Right. So in terms of balance sheet itself, current ratio is more than it is 0.99, not the most ideal. Debt to equity ratio is actually, I wouldn't say it's not the ideal, but rather it's quite high. 3.01 is actually quite high. And the PEG ratio, price to earning growth ratio, is 1.79. What does it mean? It's essentially it's a little bit overvalued. But let's see, how's the cash flow, right? The cash flow for operation itself, in terms of how the company is growing, is fluctuating. I don't see a certain trend to actually establish whether it has a growth potential. Cash flow from investment, cash flow from financial itself is not doing very well. Free cash flow as well is fluctuating. Is it in terms of financially? Is it a company that I want to put my money long term? Maybe there's better options out there for you guys to consider. So in terms of valuation, as mentioned, it's kind of overvalued right now, by $40 odd. But so in terms of, technical analysis, is it a good time since not all companies can always remain overvalued, remain undervalued? We look at technical analysis. Is it time for us to enter the stock via technical analysis, right? So here comes my this chart. Very simple. I always like to simplify thing and just draw two lines, two simple line. Simple moving average 50 versus 150. And guess what? The blue line is still above the purple line, which means 150 is still above 50. And it shows that it's a medium-term bearish mode. Yeah, so there isn't a reversal in trend yet, but if you look at the short-term modality for target itself, is actually bullish. So will it change into a medium-term bullish mode? Depends on whether institutions are going in, the whales are going in. Okay, guys. So if you guys have been following Warren Buffett's news, you will have known that he actually purchased HP, he purchased oil company, he purchased KR Cargo. So essentially, what is purchasing is more towards the defensive stocks already. So is there a potential for target? Highly likely, I would say so. Especially if you see the purple line is actually going upwards. Also, there's a tilt. So what's moving forward? That's for us to find out. But then looking at this chart also, right, I don't really like the fact that there's previous flush up, as you can tell. There are previous flush up as well. Um, so ultimately, right, what does it show us, right, is that currently the stock has reached a resistance line. All right. Will it be able to continue in the upwards momentum? Depends on whether it is able to maintain above the line. So definitely the next few days of the candlestick is very important to see whether there's a change in reversal and whether it will continue to move upwards to the upper resistance line. So yep, so this is all for me in terms of investing in Target itself. I hope you guys learn something about Target and do your own due diligence to see whether Target itself is actually a stock that you guys want to enter, right? So I'll pass the remaining time to the trade engineer to do his analysis on whether it's a stock for you guys to trade.
Yep. All right. Thanks, FINANCIAlmissy, for going into such detail on target, right? Offering both the fundamental and technical perspective. So yep, for me, I'll be offering just the technical portion of it. Yep, and I will delve into the trading aspects, right, of target, whether it is a good stock to actually trade. Yep. So before I do so, let me share my screen. All right. Yes. Yep. So as what the FINANCIAlmissy has mentioned, right, this target stock is actually one of the so-called defensive stock, right, and it has actually been trending quite recently, right. So yep. So let's go into the details on whether it is actually a good time to enter or should you wait and see. Right. And once again, right, if you are actually here with us, right, do give this video a like, right, so that we know that you are here and you can hear us loud and clear. Yep. All right. And as always, right, let me first do a quick recap, right, of what we covered last week for the last stock, right. So last week, unfortunately, we couldn't have FINANCIAlmissy with us, right, but nevertheless, we did talk about this stock called Upstart. Right, so if you haven't watched that already, you can go back and look at my last week video. It's posted on my page. Right, so let's do a quick recap of what I have actually mentioned, right, on Upstart last week. Right, so this is actually posted on my TikTok channel, right? So first of all, it's the downtrend line, right? It was resisted, right? It was still trading below the downtrend line. The uptrend line, right? It was supported by this uptrend line. Right, and we also have that first horizontal support around $85 to $87, right, and the second horizontal support at about $75. Yep, daily MACD, right, it was also negative, so it's a bit bearish. And we look at the hourly time scale, right? What do we see? We also see there was a slight bullish divergence, right? And the hourly MACD, right, it also turned positive. So there's some bullishness in the short term. Right, so you can actually check out some of the other videos on my TikTok channel. Right, the handle is shown here. Right, and if that was a bit too fast, right, let me go through in a greater detail, right, of what was mentioned in that video. Right, so first of all, we mentioned about this downtrend line. Right, so it was still a bit bearish in the sense that the price was still trading below this downtrend line. Right, and it hasn't broken above this downtrend line yet. Right, the uptrend line, right, it was still supported, right, but we couldn't be sure, right, because when it ended the previous week, right, there was testing this uptrend line, and it seems like it's going to break down, right, because it was a consecutive red candles. So there was a question we had last week whether it could actually remain supported. Right, and we identified this as the first horizontal support, like at about $85 to $87. Right, it hasn't reached there the previous time we talked about it, right? But we do have to watch out in case that uptrend line actually breaks. And if the uptrend line breaks and the horizontal support also breaks, then we could be looking at the next support level, which is about $75. Right, and to add on to the bearishness, right, we also saw the MACD, right, on daily time scale was also just negative, right, and it was increasingly so. Right, and if we look at the hourly time scale, hourly time scale do offer some signs of bullishness, right, with some bullish divergence, right, as we saw that the RSI was higher, right, forming higher lows, and the price was actually forming lower lows, right. So actually, there was this divergence that can be seen as bullish. Right, and if you look at the hourly MACD, right, contrary to the daily MACD, it was actually positive, right. In short, right, what we concluded then, there were both bull and bear arguments, right? On the bull side was mainly on the short-term time scale, right? The hourly time scale, the indicator looks positive, right? But on the bearish side, mainly on the daily time scale, right, where it was mainly below the downtrend line, the MACD was actually negative, right? And we didn't know whether the uptrend line can actually hold. So what we conclude last week, right? What we concluded last week for Upstart, right, basically is to adopt a wait and see approach first, right, to see, right, whether the uptrend line can actually remain convincingly supported, right. So that is the key, right. If it remain convincingly supported, right, we could consider going long, right, or to buy Upstart. But if not, right, we should actually wait for the next support level before entering a long position. Right. So let's see what happened like ever since then, right? For the 5 trading days ever since our last big sharing. So here's the update, right, for Upstart, right? With updated prices. So let me go through them one by one. So first of all, right, we have the downtrend line. So you can see, it continued to trade below this downtrend line, right? That's the one. So it's still bearish in that sense. The same uptrend line, right? So what we saw, right, is actually on Monday, right? This was the Monday candle, right? And on Monday itself, it actually, opened below the uptrend line, right? It actually broke below this uptrend line right from the very beginning on Monday, right? And ever since then, it has tried to break past on Tuesday, right? But eventually closed below the uptrend line, right? And ever since then, it has been trading below this uptrend line. So that was something, is what I mentioned last week. If it actually breaks the uptrend line, we should not consider a long entry and should actually wait and see. So it's a good thing, right? If you actually heeded the advice, right? Then you have to save yourself from more misery, right? If you actually bought at this point. Right, and that first horizontal support, right? So that was a level we identified. If let's say the uptrend line actually breaks, right, and this at $85 to $87. So it was supported, not very convincingly on Monday, and eventually it broke on Tuesday, right? And ever since then, you can see the last 2 days, right, it was actually trying to test this level, became the resistance level instead, right? So it used to be a support, but now it is the immediate resistance level. Right. And the second horizontal support, right? So now that it broke, both the uptrend line as well as that the first horizontal support, right? It can be falling back to this second spot, right? That is something we have to watch out, right, to see whether that bearish momentum actually continues, right? And you can see that the daily MACD, right, it continues to be negative throughout this whole period of time, right? So that adds to the bearish momentum. Right. So in conclusion, right, basically the bearish momentum for Upstart continued to outweigh the bullish momentum, right? Ever since the uptrend line and the first horizontal support was broken, right? So what should we do? We should actually continue to wait and see, like hold your horses, don't rush to enter, right? And see whether the bearish momentum will actually continue, and whether the second horizontal support will act as the ultimate support level, right? Or will you find another support level, right, before the price bounce back, right? And if you are intending to actually buy this stock, well, you have to wait, right? What I suggest is you have to wait, right, and wait for more confirmation signs, right? At least you have to wait for the downtrend line to be cleared convincingly, right, before it can actually return back to the upside. Yep. So that is just my own take on Upstart. Like do your own due diligence as always, like before you actually consider entering this stock. Yep, so that's a quick recap, right, of what I've covered last week for Upstart. And if you are enjoying what I'm sharing so far, right, don't forget to hit that like or love button, right, so that we know that you're enjoying our sharing so far. And without further ado, right, let's move on to today's stock pick. Right, so today we are now talking about Target, right? So FINANCIAlmissy has delved into a lot of detail on Target, right? So I shall go into further detail on the technical aspects for Target. Yeah, but first of all, right, let me do a brief introduction on Target. Like, why did we actually pick this stock? Right, so as we all know, right, if you've been following the macroeconomic news, right, basically, there is a growing concern of the whole macroeconomy, right, with inflation going up, right, and creating quite a bit of concern, right. So this is a particular article from Reuters, right. So basically, right, a lot of investors, right, are actually turning to defensive stocks, right, as fear of a recession grows, right. Simply put, right. So Target being a defensive stock itself, right, it can be a beneficiary from this overall sentiment if more investors actually pour their money into defensive stock, right. So you can see that this graph given in the article, right. I can see that most of the defensive stock has been outperforming the wider S&P 500 index, right. So you can see the S&P is actually in the gray line here. It's actually taking a dip, right, very recently, right, at least in April, right. But on the other hand, right, you can see that things like utilities, consumer staples, healthcare, real estate have all been climbing, right. They're bucking the trend of the S&P 500, right. So Target, being one of these defensive stock itself, it might also be benefiting from this. In fact, if we see the price chart later, actually you already saw the price chart just now, right? You have seen that the price has actually risen quite a fair bit, right, since the start of this year, right? And further reasons on why we actually picked this stock, right? So this is taken from actually Yahoo News, right? Yahoo Finance, right? And it was actually identified as a trending stock, right? And so much so that they actually posted an article on whether this trending stock is actually a potential stock to buy now, right? So this Target, right, this particular stock, Target stock, right, is actually one of the most searched for on Zacks, right? Zacks Equity Research, right? So Zacks.com. And in fact, right, you scroll down the article, right, it actually mentioned that Target is rated as Zacks rank number 2, right? So if you're not familiar with the ranking, right, basically rank number 2 for Zacks is a strong indicator to buy from based on this equity research company's perspective, right? So that's their opinion, right? So that's why we actually decided to delve into further detail on whether this stock is really a stock that you should actually buy now, right? So this is the overall price chart for Target, right? So you can see that it has fallen quite a fair bit in recent times, right? Before actually climbing back quite steeply, right? Sometime from February onwards, right? So let's look at what's some of the reasons driving this particular growth, what's driving the particular price increase, right, since February this year. Right, so here are some recent news, right, on Target, on why the prices are actually increasing, why the stock price for Target is actually increasing recently, right? So this is taken from CNBC, right? As what I mentioned here, right, the Target shares actually surged, right, as it actually mentioned that it can keep growth going beyond the pandemic, right? So so that is a very a good catalyst for the company, in the sense that if it can actually keep the growth going and continuing outside COVID pandemic, right, there could be a lot of upside for this company, right? So what I mentioned here in the article in summary, right, is basically that the pandemic has helped it, as many other of these retailer companies, right? It actually helped turbocharge sales, right? But as we all know, right, the pandemic is actually seen as a bit people are going out now, right, and it is less potent as what it was initially when it was initially unveiled to the whole world, right? Where people are falling ill, people were dying. But nowadays, people got all vaccinated. Most of the people are vaccinated, right? So it is less of a danger now, right? So increasingly, the pandemic is not much of a concern, right? So that's why being it actually saw that, and actually Target actually moved on and tried to capture the sales, right? Even if there's no pandemic, right? So one key thing they mentioned, right, is that the company forecasts, revenue growth, right, that it's going to increase, right, even the years ahead beyond the pandemic, right? And here are some further articles, right, from Foo.com, right? And what here is mentioned also is why it actually jumped 10%, right, in the week of March, right? This is very recently, just last month, right? Mainly because it just released earnings at the time, right? And it was very strong, right? So with the latest earnings at the time, right, it was actually seen as undervalued, right? So it actually delivered better than expected performance, right? Better than what analysts expected, right? And there was a positive outlook, at least for the near term, right? So one thing, right, to mention here is that Target has a strategy, right, to actually how it to maintain this growth, and is to open and upgrade stores, right, and that it's simply put has actually impress investors. What are the details right behind this? What are actually some of its strategies it's taken, right, to actually be so confident, right, of its performance down the road. Right, so here are some catalysts, right, that was identified, right. So basically, right, he has mentioned here, right, from Fools.com, right, that he has, recently done an evolution, right, in the sense that he has remodeled his stores, right, reimagined how it stages merchandise, and most importantly, integrated e-commerce, right. So e-commerce is the big thing nowadays, right. We are actually going into a lot of e-commerce platforms, right, to buy our stuff, right. Whether it's from Amazon, Shopee, right, so you can name all these are the typical brands in Singapore, right? So Target is also latching onto the e-commerce space, right? To expand its footprint there, right? So that has actually led to accelerated revenue growth, right? And it has been growing very rapidly, right? Right, and further on, right, in another full article, right? It also mentioned that digital sales make up about 90% of the business, right? And this should actually continue to be a contributor to total revenue growth, right? In fact, right, what the CEO has mentioned here is that they have scaled in same-day services and pathway for more digital growth, right? So that is something very exciting, right? The people want things to be fast, right? People want to get things quickly, right? So the fact that they are able to offer something like a same-day service, right, is very exciting, right? Because it might fulfill the demands of most consumers out there, right? And digital growth, right, as mentioned, it is latching on to this new development, and it is rapidly increasing, right? Right. So we look at further details, right, on why they actually mentioned Target could be the next growth stock, right? So actually in this article, it actually compared Target with Amazon, right? So there is this table here, right? Basically on its retail growth, right? So you can see, right, Amazon was doing very well, right, but it has been declining ever since fourth quarter of 2020, right. But on the other hand, right, Target it declined right in Q2, but it has also picked up recently in Q3 2021, right? So that is a positive sign, right? It can continue this growth momentum, right? And what I also mentioned here, right, is that it doesn't really quite show how quickly Target's digital services are growing, right? So if we look back at its recently released third quarter results, right, it also mentioned that Target same day services, right, and that includes pickup, drive up, and ship tea, right, actually grew 60%, right, on top of 200% a year ago, right? So this is explosive, right? This is something that can actually change the outlook for Target, right? So it actually made it a point of strength, right, not a weakness. And this change, right, is why the CEO and why a lot of analysts are actually very bullish about this particular stock. Yeah, but all these are their own opinion, right? So we should do our own due diligence to see whether this Target stock, is actually worth entering. So let's without further ado, delve into the future direction of Target, right? And being the trade engineer, right, I will be looking at the technicals behind this stock. Yep, but before I do so, right, don't forget to click that like and love button if you haven't done so already. Yep, and let's move on to the price chart for more details. Right, so I also put in the price chart in my PowerPoint slides, right? So let's go through some of the indicators one by one, right? So first of all, right, this is Target, right? Ticker symbol TGT, right? On the daily chart, right? So let's first of all look at that downtrend line, right? So this is a downtrend line, right? You can see it was tested here, right? And very recently, right, you go back in time, right, it will actually cross on the 7th of April, right, very convincingly. You can see this is a very strong green candle, right? And ever since then, it has traded above this downtrend line, right? So this is a bullish indicator, right? This can signify that this stock might be going for the upside, right? But we do have to watch out for other indicators, right, to see whether it is actually indeed bullish. Right. So second of all, right, we have that horizontal resistance, right, that I believe you have seen from FINANCIAlmissy as well, right? So it is that same horizontal resistance, right, at about $236 US, right? So you can see it tested numerous times before, right, over here, right, and recently here. And if we look closer in time on 17th of April, right, it actually broke slightly above, right, this resistance line, right, just slightly, right. So that's the question, and that's why FINANCIAlmissy also mentioned that we should watch and see how the price action would be like next week, right? Because this is just a slight break, of this resistance, right? We are not sure whether it has broken convincingly yet, right? So we do have to watch to see whether the price can actually stay above this resistance and this resistance becomes the support, right? If it does, then there could be further upside to this particular stock. But if not, right, it could just fall back down and test the next support level. Right. So if we do see that break, right, of that first horizontal resistance level at 236, right, and we could be watching out for other resistance level. So that more immediate resistance level, right, namely about 240, 241, right, that's the second resistance over here, right, and the third resistance is about 247. So you can see that actually there are many layers of resistance to cross, right, and they're all quite close to each other, right? So that's something you might have to consider as well, whether you want to enter, because it might be a stock that has very limited upside in that extent, right? Because it has to cross many different resistance level before you can actually see higher highs, right? So that is a question, right? To actually watch out for, right? So we do have to watch out for these levels, right? If we actually see the break of the first horizontal resistance. Right. On the other hand, right, support levels, right? What are the support levels to watch out for if this stock actually breaks down, right? So if it actually breaks down, right, the first horizontal support we should be seeing, right, is the most immediate one at about $228 to $229, right, somewhere around here, right? So this is a level to watch out for, right? To see whether price will actually break down beyond this support level, right? If it actually breaks down below this support, it could be reaching out for the next support level, right? And the uptrend line, right? So this is the more intermediate term, right? Support, right? That we should be watching out for. So currently, right, from February to now, right, it has been testing this support level, right, and staying above it, right? So for this stock to continue moving in the intermediate term, right, to be continue moving up in the intermediate term, this uptrend line has to be supported, right? And prices should continue trading above this uptrend line, right? So there's something you need to watch out for as well, right? But on the other hand, right, if you look at other indicators like the RSI, right, on daily time scale, right, you can actually see that it's approaching overbought level. It hasn't really quite reached there yet. It's actually about 65, right? The overbought level is at 70, right? But we do have to watch out, that it might be seeing, it might be approaching that overbought region, and once it reaches there, some people might actually start selling this stock, right? So that is the other indicator you have to watch out for, right? And it also exemplifies what I mentioned just now, that the upside, the short-term upside might be actually limited. Right. Daily MACD, right? Daily MACD is actually positive, right? And the gap is actually increasing, right? And very much so, right? So the question here is whether you continue to do so, whether it will make a reversal and the gap, starts to decrease and eventually turns negative, right? So that is something to watch out for. But as of the moment, it is still bullish, right? And before I delve into the summary, right, let me quickly go into the short-term time scale as well. And to do that, let me bring up my chart, right? And this is on the shorter time scale on the hourly time basis. Right, so I wanted to point out something on the hourly time basis as well, right? That's not covered in the slides. Yep, so basically we look at the hourly time scale, right? This is on the hourly time scale for target, right? We do see something very interesting, right? And that is basically, you can see the prices are forming a higher high, right? Very recently, but the RSI is forming a lower high, right? So that is also another indicator of a bearish divergence, and also something that is a concern, right? Of this stock, right? Whether this bullish momentum can continue in the short term is further thrown into question, right? In fact, this further, points out that this stock might have limited upside in the short term, right? So that's something I want to point out, at least on the hourly time scale for you to watch out for. And without further ado, let me go into the summary, right, for target, right? So if I've been talking a lot of the technical indicators, so you might be a bit lost. I'd like to do a quick recap, right, of some of the bull and bear arguments for target, right? So first of all, on the bull side of things, right, it has cleared that downtrend line, right, as I mentioned, the daily time scale, right, convincingly, right, with that green, large green candle on the 7th of April, right, very recently, right, and just last trading day on 17th of April, right, we saw that it just cleared that first horizontal resistance, right, about 236, right, it was only just clearing it, right. Yep, so as a moment, it's still trading above all the support levels, right, be it the first horizontal support or as well as the uptrend line, right. And if you look at the daily MACD, right, it is still positive and the gap is increasing, right. So, but on the bear side of things, right, we do see some indicators that are a cause of concern, right. So first of all, the daily RSI, right, it is approaching the overbought levels, right. It is about 65, right. So it is approaching that 70 level. Bearish divergence, right, as I mentioned in the hourly time scale, right, it is showing some kind of bearish divergence. So short-term upside might be a bit limited, right? And as always, right, that is the overall market sentiment, right? That is, the backdrop of the whole market, right? So we do have to watch out on the macroeconomic news. So once again, right, what should we do for trading, right? Before I delve into the details, just like to point out again that this is my own opinion, right? Please do your own due diligence, right? and my strategy might not suit everyone, right? So in my opinion, right, there is some upside, right? There could be some upside in the short time scale, but with the multiple resistance levels, right, as well as the bearish divergence we saw in the hourly time scale, the upside might be limited, right? So we can consider actually skipping this trade, right? Even if there's some small upside, because there is that unfavorable risk benefit ratio, right? Sorry for typo, but risk benefit ratio, right? So we work out the stop loss and what's the target price. You'll notice that our cut loss might actually be potentially bigger than our potential gain, right? So it's something that you might not be very favorable, as a trader, right? You don't want to risk more than you can potentially gain, right? But if you still want to do so, right, you can take a quick scalp, right, with second or third resistance level at potential target price. But do take note that it has to be a fast one, right, because there is quite limited upside, right, at least for the short term, right. Right, but if the first horizontal support actually breaks, right, then we should watch out for the next support level, which is the uptrend, the intermediate uptrend line. And as always, right, do check out the macroeconomic news, right, as well as any company specific news before entering trade, right, because all these can actually affect this particular stock. Right, and that concludes my sharing for Target. Right, I hope you enjoyed our sharing, right? And don't forget to click that like or love button, right, if you enjoyed our sharing for today, right? And you can also share that video, right, so that more people around you can benefit from our sharing, right? And if you're joining us for the very first time, right, do follow us on our social media pages, right, if you haven't done so already, right? I have my Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, right, a newly created TikTok account, right? FINANCIAlmissy has hers as well, right? You can follow her on Facebook and Instagram, right? And don't forget to comment on what you think, as well as suggest the next stock for our next sharing, right? So yep, if you have been tuning in, right, religiously every Sunday, you have known that we do hold this every Sunday at 4 p.m., right? So we hope to see you again, right, next Sunday. But before I end off, right, I just like to do an announcement for my upcoming Facebook Live this evening as well, right, at 9:30 p.m., right? So I do this every week as well, every Sunday, 9:30 p.m. for cryptocurrency, right? So for those of you who are crypto investors or crypto traders, right, you might be interested, right, in this particular sharing of mine, right? And today I'll be sharing on Bitcoin and Litecoin, right? What's the potential movement, whether it's going to run or will it be breaking down further, right? So if you're interested, you can join me at 9:30 p.m. right, tonight, right, on the Cryptoverse NFT Investor Facebook group. Right, and with that, right, I've come to the end of my session. Yep.
Right. Thank you for sharing. We do have a question from Kel. Let me just show. All right. So Kel is actually asking, right? As the market trend is still in consolidation, should we be vested or holding more cash in hand? Interesting question. Thanks for asking, Kel. Mm, for me, for myself, for myself, I'm actually holding on to more cash in hand. With the mere fact that I am actually looking for, I'm actually anticipating a recession that is coming up, especially when Fed is going to increase the interest rate more aggressively. The next Fed meeting is actually in May. So the market is going to be much more volatile than how is it going to be like if market really goes into recession. Then I guess I got more cash to actually play the market to invest. Um, However, in this particular point in time, if you want to be vested, can consider doing something more short term or companies that you think that are already undervalued and that is actually more defensive that can ride through a recession. That is when you can consider to be more vested in. But currently for me myself, my strategy right now is actually having more cash in hand and to play more defensive? How about you, trade engineer?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I think it's a very good question, right? So there's actually no right or wrong answer for this, right? So, for me, being a trader myself, right, there are always opportunities, right? Whether it is, market trends in consolidation or is the market is bullish or bearish, right? Because for trading, we can actually, there are different instruments for us to go into, right? Be it stocks, be it forex, cryptocurrency, right? So there are opportunities everywhere, right? That at any one point in time there could be one particular stock, one particular coin, right? That is going to run, right? So while the whole market might be in consolidation mode, right? Particular stocks or particular coins or particular instruments, right, can actually still run, right? So for me, right, because trading is pretty short term in nature, right, I'll still continue my own strategy, right? As long as you always have set a stop loss in place, right? So anytime when the trade goes against you, right, you can get out in time, right? And prevent yourself from further losses, right? And you always want to strike that balance, right, between taking out everything, right, and missing out the opportunity along the way, right? So there's an opportunity cost in itself, right? Or actually still being vested a little bit, but maybe minimizing your exposure, right? So that is you have to analyze your risk tolerance, right? What I suggest is actually for me myself, I will still be a bit vested, right? But I will try to trade more cautiously, right? Because of the whole volatile market and all the news that are surrounding the market. So yeah, I'll still continue trading, right? Probably not as much as before, but I'll still look out for opportunities along the way, right? Because any one point in time there are always opportunities available. All right, and I think Kel, you have another question, right? Yep. So when we all refer to short term, how short are we looking at? 1 month. Yeah, okay, that's another good question as well, right? So I think it really depends on you. So basically there are different short term levels. So for trading, right, basically 1 month is actually considered pretty long already. Yeah. So for me, trading is usually considered probably about week, 1 or 2 weeks, right? That's for me, right, as a trader, right? Sometimes even a few days, right? So that is the beauty of trading as well, right? That you can actually catch on to these small movements, right? Or basically capture these opportunities, right, on a short term basis, right? So but it really depends, right? Because even as a trader, there are different kind of traders as well. There are swing traders, there are scalp traders, right? So some swing traders might actually hold a bit longer, right? But of course, if you hold a bit longer, you are also exposing yourself to some risk in the market, right? Because for stocks, for example, right, we all know that sometimes when we hold for more than a day, right, sometimes the stock might actually get up or get down, right? Depending on what's happening, right, for the particular stock or what's happening in the whole market in general, right? So that is in a way a risk, right? But of course, yeah, if I'm investing, right, then there's a different story already, right? Then you might be looking at something more long term, right? Yep. So how about you, FINANCIAlmissy?
Yeah, so for myself, well, I'm an investor here. I like to look at the big picture, ignore all the noises, and look long term. But in this particular kind of situation or economy volatility that we are looking at, if I am very certain of the particular trade, my definition of short term is actually not more than a month because things really changes weekly, daily, weekly, or monthly basis. So my definition of short term, if I were to actually play the market now, is actually not more than a month. Yeah. So really, I mean, depending on what is your risk appetite, are you a super high risk? Are you able to tolerate day to day volatility and stuff like that? Is a question that I believe that for investors or even traders wise, you need to consider that because it's very important to know your risk appetite to see how much are you willing to invest or trade in the market, and are you okay to lose the market that you actually put in, the money that you put into the market. So yeah. So thanks for asking, Kel. I hope that we answered your question. If you guys got any questions, feel free to type in the chat as well. We would love to answer your questions too.
Yep. Thanks, Cal, once again, right, for asking those questions. I think those are very, very relatable questions that a lot of people might have, right, with regards to the current situation, right. Yep. Thanks, Cal. Thanks, Cal, for asking then.
Right. So last but not least, before we end this session, if you guys have any stocks that you guys want to, consider investing, trading, doesn't matter. Do type in the chat, let us know what is your the particular stock that you are looking at, and then we can help to actually dissect that particular company for our next session next Sunday. We are doing this every Sunday, so please do let us know. Just type in the comment below.
Yep. And I think for next Sunday, it'll be on my Facebook page, right? So we'll keep a lookout for that.
Yep.
Yep.
All right, then I guess we come to the end of our session today. Thank you guys. See you guys next week.
Yep. See you
Bye.
guys. Bye bye.